Imagine you're looking at what you think is a pretty standard marital contract from the 7th century.
Or right.
You know, you are expecting the usual rules about divorce, family dynamics, domestic life, maybe some spiritual platitudes about just, being a good spouse.
The standard domestic rule book.
Exactly. But then you put this document under a linguistic microscope, and you realize you aren't looking at a domestic rulebook at all. You are actually looking at a hidden constitutional charter.
Yeah, a massive shift in perspective.
It really is. I mean, we're talking about a text designed to systematically eradicate global slavery, mandate wealth transfers to marginalized populations, and establish a literal state-run social security system.
It completely shatters the lens we usually use for historical and religious texts. I mean, we are so conditioned to read these documents as guides for individual piety.
Right, like a personal self-help book.
Exactly. We read them to find out how to be a good person in the privacy of our own homes. But the scholar we are diving into today, Allama G.A. Parwez, he argues that this intensely individualized reading isn't just, slightly off the mark.
It's entirely obscuring the point.
Yeah. He claims it fundamentally obscures the actual rigid socioeconomic state legislation that is literally encoded into the text.
So I want to lay out the mission for this deep dive immediately. For those of you listening, we are zeroing in on a specific chapter of the Quran today. It's Surah An-Nisa.
Surah An-Nisa, yes.
And historically, if you ask almost anyone what Surah An-Nisa is about, they will tell you it's the chapter regarding women.
Right.
They'll point out that it discusses marriage, it discusses inheritance, and they usually treat it as this collection of domestic suggestions. Or, in some traditions, they're just viewed as ritualistic verses to be recited for blessings.
Just spiritual placeholders, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And then on the flip side, some modern critics go further and argue it's a deeply patriarchal text. But Parwez drops this massive, just incredibly provocative thesis onto the table.
He really does.
He proposes that Surah An-Nisa is actually a universal manifesto for human rights. He argues it's a blueprint for a central authority, what he calls the markaz, to ensure that literally no human being in society is left without sustenance.
And, he arrives at this conclusion not through some vague theological mysticism, but through a granular systemic extraction of the linguistics.
Right, he's looking at the actual grammar.
Exactly. Parwez points out that for centuries, these verses haven't just been read merely as magical charms or personal blessings. They have actively been weaponized by certain orthodox interpreters to justify biological subjugation.
Which is heavy. I mean, we are talking about historical justifications for concubinage, unchecked polygamy, and these massive systemic class divisions.
Yeah, the worst kind of exploitation.
Yeah.
But Parwez argues that when you strip away centuries of cultural accumulation, the baggage of empires, and you look at the actual structural grammar of the Quranic Arabic, you find a transitionary constitutional charter meant for a post-war society.
Okay, I have to play devil's advocate here for a second.
Sure, go for it.
Calling a 7th century religious text a constitutional charter, that is an incredibly heavy modern phrase.
It is.
I mean, when we think of modern constitutions, we think of mechanisms of enforcement, economic policy, demographic management. When people hear religious text, they think of moral guidelines, right? Not state-sponsored economic rehabilitation.
Right. They think of be nice to your neighbor.
Exactly. So how does Parwez actually justify framing it as a rigid socio-legal framework?
Well, he justifies it by demanding we look at the mafhum.
Mafhum.
Yeah, which translates to the real underlying meaning of the terminology. Because think about how language degrades or shifts over 1,000 years. Words absorb the cultural baggage of the empires that use them.
Right. The word awesome used to mean terrifying, and now it just means a hot dog is good.
Exactly. Language drifts. So Parwez insists that to understand the legislative intent of Surah An-Nisa, we have to look at the socioeconomic conditions of the society it was addressing at that exact moment.
And what were those conditions?
It was a society dealing with the catastrophic aftermath of war. And war doesn't just kill soldiers on a battlefield. It destroys the economic providers of a community.
It creates massive vulnerable demographics overnight.
Precisely. So the text is attempting to manage a severe demographic crisis. Let's look at the actual demographics this charter is targeting.
Let's do it.
The text repeatedly uses the terms yatana and nisa. Now, traditionally, yatama is translated simply as orphans.
Right.
And nisa is translated as women. So it sounds like a very straightforward moral imperative, be nice to orphans and women.
Which is how almost everyone reads it. It feels like a standard ethical platitude.
But Parwez argues the text is doing something much more sophisticated in the realm of statecraft. He says the Quran moves away from treating Nisa merely as a biological gender.
Wait, really? It's not just referring to women as a gender?
Not in this specific legislative context, no. In the context of this socioeconomic framework, Nisa and Yatama are framed as functional demographics requiring systemic societal protection.
Okay. Unpack that a bit.
Sure. So Yatama aren't just children who lost their parent. The linguistic root of the word implies individuals who are left completely alone and vulnerable in the struggle of life.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they are the economically disenfranchised, anyone cut off from the economic engine.
That makes a lot of sense when you consider the historical reality of war. I mean, if an entire generation of working men is wiped out on a battlefield, you are left with thousands of individuals, widows, children, the elderly, who suddenly have zero access to the economic engine of society.
Exactly. You aren't just dealing with women and orphans in a sentimental Hallmark card sense.
You are dealing with an impending economic collapse and mass starvation.
Which completely recontextualizes the most controversial and highly debated verses in this surah.
You're talking about the verses regarding marriage and polygamy.
Yes. Historically, the allowance for multiple wives up to 4 has often been interpreted through the lens of male biological desire. It's been framed as a broad license.
And this is where I struggle with Parwez's thesis of this being a human rights manifesto. Because for you listening, how do you reconcile a universal manifesto for human rights with a system that allows one man to marry 4 women?
It's a tough pill to swallow.
To a modern listener, that sounds inherently unequal. It sounds like you're building a harem, not a social safety net.
Parwez tackles this head-on, and his semantic shift completely dismantles that traditional view.
Okay, how so?
He argues that the baseline universal rule in the Quranic system is actually wada zawj,
Which means?
absolute monogamy.
Wait, the baseline is monogamy?
Yes, the allowance for multiple wives is rigorously redefined not as the norm, but as an istisna, an exception. And crucially, it is an exception designed purely for emergency societal conditions.
So it's not a biological license, it's an emergency housing measure.
It is a strict institutional protection mechanism. Think back to the demographic crisis we just discussed. You have orphan girls and widows who've been left completely destitute by the socioeconomic upheavals of war.
Right.
In a 7th century context, there are no state-run orphanages. There are no welfare hotels or government food stamps.
If these women and children are not absorbed into stable households, they will literally be out on the streets.
And subject to the most horrific forms of exploitation and violence. So the central authority is essentially conscripting families to take in the most vulnerable.
Wow. The Markaz allows this restricted demographic absorption, so these women are granted the full legal protections, economic rights, and social dignity of a wife in a highly patriarchal historical setting.
Exactly. It is framed as a heavy burden.
Yeah.
It's a societal responsibility taken on to provide a safety net, not a playground for male lust.
I see the logic there, but I mean, it still feels like it could easily be abused.
How so?
Well, if the state is saying absorb these vulnerable people into your household, what stops a wealthy, powerful individual from just hoarding dependents under the guise of charity?
That's a great question, and Parwez points to a very specific phrase in the text to answer that. The phrase is Allah ta'ulu.
Allah tolu. Okay, what does that traditionally mean?
Traditionally, translators have rendered this phrase as that you may not do injustice.
Right.
The implication being that if you can't treat multiple wives equally, you should only marry one.
Which is the standard defense you hear today, right? Like, you can have 4, but only if you treat them perfectly equally, which is impossible, so you should probably just stick to 1.
Right, but Parwez uncovers a much deeper macroeconomic layer to the phrase ala tolu. He translates it as preventing the state and the individual from being crushed under the heavy burden of excessive dependence.
Wait, are you saying the text is establishing a constitutional cap based on resource management, like actual family planning?
That is exactly his argument. A state trying to provide universal sustenance will mathematically collapse if the population of dependents outpaces the production of resources.
That's just basic economics.
Right. So the system is laying down a pragmatic socioeconomic cap. It is telling the society, do not take on more dependents than your economic bandwidth can reasonably support.
Because if you do,
The entire social structure will buckle under the weight.
That completely transforms the verse. It takes it out of the realm of domestic bedroom politics and places it squarely in the realm of demographic and economic policy.
It's the state regulating its own carrying capacity.
It really is. But if we are talking about vulnerable demographics and the carrying capacity of a society, we have to talk about the absolute most vulnerable class in that historical era.
Yes, we do.
We have to talk about slaves. And honestly, looking at the sources provided for this deep dive, this is where Parwez's analysis absolutely floored me.
You were referring to his analysis of the grammatical abolition of slavery? It is, without exaggeration, a masterclass in legislative drafting.
It is. But before we get to his analysis, let's set the table for you listening. Because the historical reality is that for over 1,000 years, various Islamic empires had massive, brutal slave trades.
They did.
And Orthodox traditionalists historically used a very specific phrase from the Quran to justify this.
The phrase is, Mal malakat aymanukum.
Right. Those under your authority, or as the more archaic translations put it, what your right hands possess.
Correct. And for centuries, this phrase was used by certain factions to justify perpetual concubinage.
So the historical argument went something like this. If you capture women in war, they fall into the category of what your right hands possess. Therefore, they are property.
Yes, and the justification was that they could be utilized sexually without the formal legal rights, financial protections, or social standing of marriage.
Which brings me to my major pushback. If Parwez is arguing that this text is a human rights manifesto, how does he reconcile the fact that massive empires read this exact text and built global slave trades out of it? Is he just ignoring the history?
He isn't ignoring it at all.
Yeah.
He's diagnosing it as a catastrophic corruption of the text's original linguistics.
Okay, so he's saying they read it wrong on purpose.
Basically, yes.
Yay.
Parwez argues that the empires ignored the structural grammar of the Arabic because the slave trade was simply too economically lucrative to give up.
Follow the money.
Always. He points out a semantic shift that is incredibly subtle but structurally devastating to the institution of slavery. He noticed that the Quran exclusively locks the phrase ma malakat aymanukum into the past tense.
The past tense.
Exclusively. Throughout the entire text, it never uses a future or present continuous tense for this demographic. Never. It never says those who will become your slaves or those you are actively enslaving. The exact linguistic translation, according to Parwez, is those who had already come under your subordination prior to the revelation of these laws.
Okay, I want everyone listening to really visualize the mechanics of what you're describing because it functions exactly like a modern legislative grandfather clause.
It does. It's a perfect parallel.
Let's use an analogy to make this clear. Suppose a modern government realizes that a specific type of vehicle is destroying the ozone layer and they want to completely eradicate it from the country.
Okay.
They can't just pass a law saying, as of midnight tonight, these vehicles are illegal and will be confiscated. If they did that, millions of people wouldn't be able to get to work tomorrow.
Supply chains would freeze.
Exactly. The economy would implode.
Yeah.
So what does the government do? They pass a grandfather clause. They say, it is now illegal to manufacture or sell any new vehicles of this type. The supply chain is dead. But if you already own one of these cars, it is grandfathered in. You can keep driving it until it naturally breaks down, at which point you must transition to the new system.
That is a brilliant parallel to the social physics at play in 7th century Arabia. We have to remember how deeply entrenched slavery was in the global consciousness at that time.
It was everywhere.
It was. I mean, Aristotle, one of the foundational minds of Western philosophy, he literally argued that certain people were naturally born for subjugation. He famously referred to slaves as crooked shoes for crooked feet.
That's horrifying.
It is, but it was the standard worldview. The entire global economy, the Romans, the Persians, the pre-Islamic Arabs, ran on human trafficking. It was the electricity of the ancient world.
So if the Quran had ordered an abrupt overnight emancipation of all slaves,
the society would have violently rejected the system, or the economic structure would have completely collapsed. But more importantly, think about the enslaved individuals themselves.
what do you mean?
If you suddenly emancipate a massive population of traumatized, uneducated people who have been denied the ability to own property or build wealth for generations,
Yeah.
and you just throw them out into the streets of a 7th century desert society with zero resources.
They would starve. Or they would just be re-enslaved by neighboring tribes who didn't follow the new laws. It would be a total humanitarian disaster.
Exactly. So the Quran deployed a highly sophisticated transitionary legal framework. By locking the phrase malakati manukum into the past tense, it legally barred the creation of any new slaves.
It shut down the manufacturing plant.
But it simultaneously grandfathered in the existing vulnerable demographic. It formally acknowledged them in the legal code to ensure they were protected by the state from sudden economic destitution.
It's just genius. By restricting a single phrase to the past tense, the system structurally engineers the eventual extinction of an entire harmful industry.
Yes.
It's not just a moral plea saying slavery is bad, please stop. It is deploying a legislative algorithm to delete the institution from the social code mathematically over a single generation without collapsing the society.
And this algorithm requires a second step.
Yeah.
Because once you have grammatically capped the vulnerable population, meaning the pool of marginalized people is only going to shrink, it can never grow. The system must ensure their survival.
Right, because a grandfather clause only works if you actually help people transition to the new system. You can't just say no new slaves and then leave the existing ones to rot in their current condition.
Right. The state has to actively move resources, it has to reorganize wealth.
Which introduces us to the concept of nizam-i-rubaiyat.
The economic engine of nourishment and sustenance.
Yes. And Parwez focuses heavily on Surah An-Nisa, verse 4, which deals with the constitutional transfer of wealth to women. And again, he contrasts the traditional cultural practices with the actual words used in the text.
Let's look at the cultural baseline first, just so we know what we're comparing it to. Historically, marital law across almost all ancient cultures involved a transactional purchase of a woman's reproductive labor. It was a bride price.
Like buying property.
Basically. The man pays the woman's family, and in exchange, he acquires rights over her. The traditional Arabic term for this transactional payment is mar.
Right, mar. But the text of the Quran doesn't use the word mar.
No, it completely avoids it. Parwez highlights this deliberate omission. Instead of mar, the text uses the word Saduqāt.
Saduqāt.
Yes, which is derived from the root sadak, meaning truth or sincerity. So right away, it removes the concept of a commercial transaction and frames the wealth transfer as tangible proof of genuine affection and commitment.
That's a big shift.
But it goes further by pairing it with another very specific word, nelatin.
Now, the notes provided a really vivid etymological study of this word, and I love this part. Nilotin shares a root with the Arabic word for bee, nal.
Think about the mechanics of what a bee does. A bee travels for miles, gathers nectar, deposits pure honey into the hive, and then simply flies away.
The bee doesn't stick around to ask the hive for wages.
Exactly. It doesn't present an invoice. It doesn't demand the honey back if it gets angry a week later.
Right.
So nilotan signifies a pure, unsolicited gift given without the expectation of extracting labor, wages, or subservience in return.
Applying that bee analogy to this economic engine is fascinating. It means this wealth transfer to the woman is a non-negotiable constitutional duty of faridha.
Yes.
The state is legally outlawing the cultural coercion where men treat the payment as a lease on the woman's body or where they manipulate the woman into giving the money back later. If a man gives her a heap of gold upon marriage, the state forbids him from taking back a single ounce.
This establishes the unconditional financial independence of free women. It elevates the marriage contract from a transaction of chattel to an equitable partnership where the woman possesses uncoerced, independent wealth that she exclusively controls.
She has her own capital.
Exactly. Now, the text does acknowledge human agency. It mentions that if a woman decides, of her own volition, to return a portion of this wealth to the household, she can do so.
And the word used for this is tibna.
Right. But Parwez makes a very important point that tibna isn't just a casual giving it back. The cultural context is vital here.
Because throughout history, men have been very, very good at technically giving women property and then psychologically terrorizing them into signing it right back over.
Yes, the coerced gift. We see it all the time. Parwez stresses that tibna requires absolute uncoerced psychological happiness and free will. The root implies a state of total internal purity and satisfaction.
So no guilt trips?
None. If there is even a hint of guilt, manipulation, or emotional blackmail from the husband, the return of the wealth is legally invalid under this framework. The psychological state of the giver is paramount to the legality of the transfer.
Okay, so the system enforces the financial independence of women entering marriage. But what about the enslaved demographic we were just talking about, the grandfathered class?
Right.
How does the central authority, the markaz, handle their economic elevation? Because giving someone their freedom is completely meaningless if they don't have a way to feed themselves.
That brings us to one of the most radically misinterpreted institutions in Islamic history, the institution of makatabat.
I really want to spend some time here because the traditional definition of makatabat is grim.
It's incredibly dark.
Historically, clerics interpreted this as a contract of self-ransom. The idea was that a slave could approach their master and say, I want to be free. And the master would say, okay, write up a contract. You owe me 10,000 gold coins. Go work in the fields. And once you pay me off, you earn your biological freedom.
Which forces the victim of slavery to purchase their own humanity through years of unpaid labor.
It's extortion.
Parwez argues that this traditional interpretation is a profound distortion that merely continues biological subjugation under the guise of a contract. He completely dismantles the idea of self-ransom.
So what does he say it actually means?
He points to the linguistics again to redefine makatabat as a mandatory, state-sponsored economic rehabilitation program.
Explain how that works. Because if the slave isn't paying the master, who is paying whom?
The burden shifts entirely. Parwez argues that the Quranic injunction mandates that once an enslaved individual demonstrates the capability and desire to stand on their own 2 feet, society isn't just encouraged to let them go.
The state is legally obligated to facilitate their independence.
Yes. And crucially, they cannot be freed empty-handed. The term makatabat, within the context of the state's wealth distribution laws, inherently includes the mandate that the central authority must provide startup capital to the newly freed individual.
This is where I started drawing analogies to modern venture capital or state welfare. It is a 7th century enterprise grant.
That's exactly what it is.
The system is saying, we recognize that you were wronged by the historical institution of slavery. We recognize you have skills. Maybe you're a carpenter or an artisan. We aren't just going to open the door and push you into poverty.
Right. Here is the seed money provided by the state to start your own business and integrate into the free market.
It acts as a precursor to the concept of universal basic income. It proves that the Quranic system views true freedom not merely as the absence of iron chains, but as the presence of state-enforced economic capability.
Because releasing a subjugated person without a financial safety net isn't liberation, it's abandonment.
It inevitably leads to poverty, crime, and eventual re-exploitation. The state must provide capital grants to ensure socioeconomic parity.
That is an incredible structural safety net. It completely changes the definition of emancipation.
It really does. But it raises a really difficult question about the transition period.
What do you mean?
Well, if the state is reorganizing wealth to elevate these subjugated classes, how does the legal system handle them before they are fully integrated?
I see.
Because if you have a class of people who have been traumatized and denied education for generations, they are going to struggle to adapt to the moral and legal standards of a free society. How does the law judge them?
You are hitting on the jurisprudence of proportional justice, which is another area where Parwez's analysis flips historical norms completely upside down.
Let's unpack that.
Let's look at how global legal systems historically handled class disparity. Usually, the harshest, most brutal punishments were reserved for the lowest classes, the slaves, the serfs, the peasants.
Right.
Meanwhile, the privileged elites, the nobility, the wealthy, were granted leniency, pardons, or allowed to pay fines to escape physical punishment.
The classic rules for thee but not for me. The justice system acts as an enforcer for the aristocracy.
Exactly. But Parwez reveals that the Quranic legal framework inverted this entirely. Surah An-Nisa maintained distinct legal categories for free women and for the Malakat Aymanukum demographic, the existing grandfathered enslaved class.
Now, traditionalists sometimes use this linguistic distinction to justify disparate physical or sexual treatment, arguing that slave women were fundamentally lesser.
And Parwez says that is a catastrophic misreading of why the distinction exists in the first place.
So why keep the terms distinct in the law if the ultimate goal is total equality? Why not just say everyone is exactly the same under the law?
Because treating unequal people exactly the same is actually a form of injustice.
Oh, interesting.
The blueprint recognizes the reality of diminished responsibility and mitigating circumstances. Consider the psychology here. A girl raised in a free home, provided with dignity, a comprehensive education, financial security, and moral training. She possesses a high ethical capacity.
She knows the rules, and she has the resources to abide by them.
Right. Conversely, consider a girl who was captured in war, sold in a market, subjected to the degradation of slavery, and deliberately denied an education.
Yeah.
She possesses a completely different mental landscape and ethical conditioning.
Of course she does. She's traumatized.
Exactly. So the semantic distinction exists in the legal code, not to oppress her, but to protect the traumatized class from the rigid legal expectations placed upon the privileged class.
This makes so much sense. How did that actually manifest in the penal code?
It manifested in the injunction of fractional punishment. The Quranic law mandates that if a woman from the subjugated, uneducated class commits a moral crime, her legal punishment must be exactly half that of a free, educated woman who commits the same crime.
Half. The law literally caps the punishment at 50% for the traumatized class.
Yes.
That is a constitutional acknowledgement of systemic trauma. It's forcing the state to recognize its own failure to protect and educate that individual.
It is the ultimate institutional accountability. The Quran places the blame squarely on the society. Parwez notes that demanding high ethical fortitude from a demographic that society has deliberately crushed violates the physics of justice.
You cannot harvest high ethics from a field you have salted.
Beautifully put, yes.
This really makes you question our modern Western concept of blind justice. I mean, we always see the statue of Lady Justice wearing a blindfold, and the idea is supposed to be noble. The law treats everyone exactly the same, whether you are a billionaire CEO or a person living on the street.
Right, that's the ideal we are taught.
But this Quranic framework argues that blind justice is actually blind cruelty, treating everyone exactly the same, regardless of the poverty, the trauma, or the educational deficits inflicted upon them by the state, completely ignores causality.
Yes, and modern legal systems are only just beginning to catch up to this logic. We are starting to see judges consider mitigating circumstances where a defendant's socioeconomic disenfranchisement or childhood trauma legally reduces their culpability.
But the fractional punishment in the Quran established this 1400 years ago as a mathematical, physical manifestation of society bearing its share of the blame for the individual's diminished capacity.
Exactly.
Okay, I want to briefly recap where we are because the architecture of this system is just immense.
It's a lot to hold in your head at once.
It is. So the linguistics cap the creation of new slaves through a grammatical grandfather clause.
Yeah.
The wealth transfers and the Mukatabat enterprise grants ensure the economic elevation of the existing vulnerable classes. And the penal code's fractional punishment protects the traumatized during their transition to freedom.
Right. The internal system is locked in.
But here is the massive elephant in the room.
Let's hear it.
How does the system permanently stop the influx of new vulnerable people from the outside? Because you can fix your internal laws all you want, but if you go to war and constantly import new prisoners of war as slaves, the system fails. The leak in the boat is just too big.
And that requires us to look at the global supply chain of slavery at the time. How were slaves manufactured?
Historically, prisoners of war, or POWs, were the primary universal source of the global slave trade.
Yes. When the Romans, the Greeks, or the pre-Islamic Arabs conquered a city or won a battle, the captured men were routinely converted into permanent manual laborers, and the captured women were distributed as concubines.
It was a perpetual cycle of human trafficking fueled by continuous tribal and imperial warfare. The spoils of war were literally human beings.
So if a society operating under this Quranic constitution is attacked, and they fight back and take prisoners, what do they do with them? How does the manual address the supply chain?
Right. How does it stop it?
It addresses it explicitly in Surah Muhammad, verse 47.4. This verse acts in tandem with Surah An-Nisa. It restricts the central authority's handling of POWs to only two constitutional options.
Only two.
Just two. When the battle is over and the dust settles, the state must either release the prisoners unconditionally as an act of grace and goodwill, which is the term man, or release them in exchange for ransom, reciprocal agreements, or war reparations, which is fida.
Man or fida, grace or exchange.
Yes. And what Parwez emphasizes most heavily here is what is missing from that verse, the absolute absence of a third option.
Meaning enslavement is constitutionally omitted, it's off the table entirely.
Precisely.
The state doesn't even have the legal authority to enslave a captive.
By restricting the state to only releasing prisoners via grace or ransom, the Quran permanently disabled the supply chain. It shut the only door through which new slaves entered society.
It shifted the international status of POWs from biological chattel to be owned to temporary detainees whose ultimate destination must be freedom.
And the sources map this directly to the precursor to the Geneva Conventions. Think about the logistics of this in the 7th century. There were no massive state-run concentration camps or high-security prisons back then to hold thousands of POWs while ransoms were negotiated.
So how did they house them?
They distributed them among the households of the community, but legally classified them as guests rather than property.
Just.
Yes. There are incredible, well-documented historical accounts from the Battle of Badr, which was the first major military engagement of the early Muslim community.
What happened at Badr?
The Muslims were heavily outnumbered but won the battle and took several high-ranking Meccan aristocrats as prisoners. These POWs later reported that their Muslim captors treated them with a level of dignity that shocked them.
Really? Like how?
The captors fed the POWs the finest wheat bread available, while the captors themselves survived on mere dates. They prioritized the nourishment of the prisoner over their own.
That is staggering. You just fought a brutal battle against these men, and now you are giving them your best food.
And the ransom part, the fida, it wasn't always just a financial transaction either.
What if a prisoner was poor and their tribe wouldn't pay to get them back?
The system was highly progressive and focused on societal elevation. If POWs from the Battle of Badr couldn't afford a financial ransom, the Prophet established a rule that their freedom could be secured simply by utilizing their skills.
For instance,
A literate prisoner could earn their absolute freedom by teaching 10 Muslim children how to read and write.
I want to pause on that because the psychology of it is brilliant. It transforms war captivity from a mechanism of physical exploitation into an opportunity for human development and educational exchange.
And it breaks the psychological cycle of warfare. If you conquer an enemy population and enslave them, you guarantee generational hatred.
Their children will grow up dreaming of the day they can slaughter your children in vengeance. It ensures perpetual war.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But if you capture your enemy, bring them into your home, feed them your best food, and let them earn their freedom by sitting down and teaching your children how to read. The psychological motivation for retaliatory warfare just collapses.
You are turning an enemy combatant into your child's tutor. It's almost impossible to maintain a blood feud under those conditions.
Parwez notes that the Quranic social physics dictate that by implementing this mandatory, dignified release, the war will lay down its burdens. It's an eradication of the source of oppression, not just a management of its symptoms.
The supply chain is severed.
Severed completely.
Okay, so the legislation is flawless on paper. No new slaves can be made. The existing ones are protected, granted venture capital, and phased out. But I have to push back on the human element here.
Sure.
Because legislation is one thing, sociology is another. Did society actually accept these freed people? We know from modern history, look at the abolition of slavery in the United States, that even when slavery is legally abolished, the stigma, the racism, the caste system, it lingers for centuries. You don't just pass a law and suddenly everyone invites the former slaves to dinner.
No, you don't.
So how did the early community actually execute this social integration?
This is a crucial point, and it's where we look at the prophetic model of radical social mobility.
Okay.
The Prophet Muhammad didn't just sign decrees freeing slaves. He actively, systemically absorbed them into the absolute highest echelons of society. His goal was to completely shatter the Arabian caste system, which was based on a concept called nasab, or lineage.
Explain nasab for us. How rigid was this class structure?
It was the defining feature of Arabian society. The pre-Islamic Quraysh, the ruling tribe in Mecca, operated on strict, arrogant bloodline supremacy. They believed their DNA made them inherently superior.
Show a caste system.
A brutal one. A nobleman would rather die than sit at the same table as someone he deemed genetically inferior, let alone take orders from them. So the Prophet knew that merely freeing slaves wasn't enough. He had to break the psychology of nasab.
And he started the systemic shift with a specific individual, right? A man named Zayd.
Yes. Zayd was a slave given to the Prophet by his wife Khadijah long before his prophethood began. The Prophet immediately freed him.
Right.
Years later, when Zayd's biological father tracked him down and came to Mecca to take him back to his home tribe, Zayd was given the choice to leave. But Zayd refused. He told his father that the Prophet's home offered an unparalleled level of dignity and love.
And how did the Prophet respond to Zayd's loyalty?
In a society obsessed with bloodlines, the Prophet didn't just keep Zayd around as a freed servant. He took Zayd to the Kaaba, the absolute center of Meccan society, and legally declared Zayd his adopted son and heir, completely erasing his identity as a former slave.
He destroyed the nasab right there. He proved that human dignity and familial bonds are based on character and capability, not birth. But he went even further than adoption, didn't he?
He took it to the ultimate societal stress test, marriage.
Oh, wow.
To prove to the aristocracy that a freed slave is the absolute social equal of a freeborn noble, The Prophet arranged the marriage of his own cousin, Zainab, a fearfully proud aristocratic woman from the elite Banu Hashim tribe, to Zayd.
Social absorption via elite marriage. That must have sent shockwaves through the aristocracy. I mean, the idea of a woman of high nobility marrying a man who used to be property.
It was deeply uncomfortable for the society, which was exactly the point. It was state-sponsored social engineering designed to force the aristocracy to swallow their pride.
And did it work?
It did. It transformed the societal mindset entirely.
Yeah.
Eventually, you had the highest noblemen of the Quraysh actively seeking to marry their daughters to men like Bilal, a freed Abyssinian slave who had become the first caller to prayer.
Incredible.
But the ultimate proof of this institutional absorption wasn't just in marriage. It was in political and military supremacy.
And this brings us to the story of Usama, which I think is the most compelling historical evidence in the notes. Usama was Zayd's son, correct?
Yes, Usama was a young man, but in the eyes of the old Arabian caste system, he carried the stigma of his father. He was viewed as a slave, the son of a slave.
Right, the lineage stain.
During the final days of his life, the Prophet organized a massive army to march toward the Byzantine border to face the Roman Empire. This was the most critical military expedition of the time.
Who was in this army?
The absolute elite. The senior aristocratic companions who had been with the Prophet from the very beginning. Men like Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Khalid bin Walid, the greatest military minds and the future leaders of the empire.
And who commanded them?
The Prophet appointed Usama as the commander-in-chief.
Picture the scene for a moment. You have the most elite, battle-hardened veterans of Arabia men who used to define their entire worth by their bloodline. And the central authority places a teenager, the son of a freed slave, at the head of the army, commanding these aristocrats to take orders from him.
Imagine the psychological friction.
There had to be friction.
There was. Some people grumbled about a youth commanding the elders, but the Prophet was resolute. He placed the flag of leadership directly into Usama's hand.
It was a hyper-meritocracy.
Yes, it wasn't just equality on paper. It was the state actively placing the most marginalized individuals into supreme leadership positions over the aristocracy to violently shatter the last remnants of caste prejudice.
And Parwez highlights this as a profound governance directive. It established a cause-and-effect reality. True civilizational strength is achieved only through absolute meritocracy.
Exactly. When a state removes the artificial barriers of class, race, and caste, it unleashes the full potential of its populace.
A society deprives itself of immense talent and resilience when it crushes demographics under the label of low-born.
It is the ultimate realization of the Human Rights Manifesto we've been discussing. But as with any system, there is always the danger of human corruption. People always try to find loopholes.
Right. What happens if a society ignores this constitutional blueprint? What if they attempt to bypass the financial empowerment, the systemic integration, and rely instead on performative acts to look like they are following the rules?
That brings us to Parwez's final major concept, the social physics, or what he calls the law of requital.
The law of requital.
Yes. The Quranic system operates on strict cause and effect. It asserts that actions have inevitable consequences, much like the laws of physics. If you touch fire, you burn. If a society embraces exploitation, it collapses.
The physics of mocking the system. The notes give a really specific, almost infuriating example of how societies try to cheat the economic engine we discussed earlier, the mar, the wealth transfer to women.
Yes. Remember that the system mandates a substantial, uncoerced transfer of capital to ensure a woman's financial independence. Parwez discusses how later cultures developed a workaround. They created the concept of a shari mar, a so-called Islamic dowry that met the legal requirement on paper, but violated the entire spirit of the law.
How did they do that?
They would fix this dowry at a mockingly low value. The specific example Parwez gives from his time in the subcontinent is fixing the mar at exactly 32 rupees.
32 rupees. The text points out that wouldn't even buy a pair of shoes.
Precisely. By signing a marriage contract for 32 rupees, the society attempts to bypass female financial empowerment while technically waving a piece of paper saying, look, we fulfilled the religious requirement.
It's insulting.
The Quran explicitly warns, do not take the verses of Allah in mockery. Attempting to use a meaningless contract to circumvent the divine obligation to elevate women is legally and socially mocking the system.
And what is the consequence of that mockery, according to the law of requital?
The law dictates that God mocks those who mock him. Now, this isn't about God laughing at people. It's about the inevitable backlash of social physics.
Right, cause and effect.
Societies that maintain systemic inequality, keeping women financially dependent, keeping classes stratified, while performing these empty ritualistic acts, will wander blindly in darkness. They will face inevitable civilizational ruin because their internal structure is rotting.
This leads to what I think is the most striking analogy in the entire deep dive, Parwez's analogy of the Hindu moneylenders.
It is a profound, searing illustration of the hypocrisy of ritualistic charity.
Walk us through it.
Parwez describes a phenomenon he observed during his time in India. There were certain wealthy moneylenders who were ruthless in their business practices. They charged exorbitant interest rates, completely trapping the working class in generational debt.
Okay.
But to soothe their conscience and earn good karma, these same moneylenders would wake up early in the morning, go to the market, buy a cage full of trapped birds, and set them free into the sky.
They are buying indulgences, they are freeing birds to feel holy while they literally suck the blood of human beings.
Exactly.
Okay.
And Parwez applies this analogy directly to the institution of slavery and the corruption of the Quranic text. He argues that intentionally capturing humans in war, maintaining a continuous slave trade, and then occasionally freeing a single slave just to earn good karma as an act of charity
is mathematically flawed social physics.
Yes.
Because morality isn't about occasional acts of charity within a corrupt system. It is the fundamental structural dismantling of exploitation itself.
Right. If you are manufacturing slaves just so you can feel good about freeing one every now and then, you are the moneylender freeing the bird while crushing the human. You are mocking the system.
That is the exact parallel. And it's here that we really need to address a very specific, deeply controversial critique Parwez makes in the source material regarding modern Orthodox interpretations.
Yes.
And just to be completely clear for you listening, we're strictly reporting what's in Parwez's analysis here. We aren't taking sides or endorsing viewpoints on what is obviously a massive, politically and religiously charged theological debate. We are just unpacking the sources we have.
Important context for sure. So in the text, Parwez heavily critiques modern Orthodox clerics, specifically naming Abul al-Maududi, a very prominent 20th century Islamic revivalist.
Okay.
Parwez asserts that over a millennium before the 1948 United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights mandated the abolition of slavery, the Quran had already declared a total systemic war against human subjugation.
Right.
However, according to Parwez's critique, figures like Maududi actively rejected the UN Charter's stance on slavery.
The sources state that Maududi's rejection was based on maintaining the right to keep concubines and enslave POWs, relying on centuries of corrupted historical jurisprudence rather than the structural grammar of the text.
That is Parwez's assertion. The text quotes Maududi's commentary, which suggests that soldiers had the right to enjoy captured women distributed by the government without the necessity of formal marriage and without limits on the number of concubines, completely bypassing the restriction to 4 wives. Parwez argues this directly violates the Quranic mandate of Surah An-Nisa and Surah Muhammad. By ignoring the past tense restriction of the grandfather clause, and by ignoring the mandate to either release POWs by grace or ransom, Parwez views this orthodox stance as a dangerous, horrific reversion to biological subjugation.
He argues it is fundamentally at odds with the Quranic manifesto of human rights.
Yes.
It really shows how incredibly high the stakes are in how a society interprets its foundational texts. This isn't just an academic debate about Arabic grammar in a classroom somewhere.
No, it has real-world consequences.
If you misread the grammar, if you ignore the past tense restriction of a single phrase, you can build an entire theological and legal justification for human trafficking and sexual exploitation.
Which is exactly why Parwez insists on extracting the systemic linguistic blueprint rather than relying on centuries of cultural accumulation and imperial jurisprudence.
Yeah.
The empires wanted slaves, so they read the text to allow slaves. Parwez is trying to strip that away.
So let's bring this all together into a synthesis. As we wrap up this deep dive, what is the mustaqila qadar, the permanent value, established in Parwez's analysis of Surah An-Nisa?
The permanent value is a radical redefinition of human rights. True freedom and human dignity are not merely the absence of iron chains. Surah An-Nisa, when understood systemically, proves that human rights require the presence of state-enforced economic capability and social equity.
It is a masterclass in transitional socioeconomics.
It demands that a society protect its vulnerable, not through performative charity, not by freeing a bird while charging usury, but through rigorous structural, constitutional guarantees of wealth independence, and absolute meritocracy.
It completely redefines what this text is. I mean, we started by looking at Surah An-Nisa as a list of domestic rules about marriage and divorce.
And we realized it's a meticulously drafted algorithm designed to eradicate slavery, enforce macroeconomic family planning, transfer venture capital to the marginalized, and guarantee female financial independence.
It proves that the text is, as Parwez argues, a rigid socio-legal framework for a functional state.
But of course, a blueprint is just a piece of paper without an engineer.
Right. We've seen how this incredible system protects the individual, how it disables the supply chain of oppression, and how it mandates wealth distribution. But a system needs enforcement.
It does.
How does the Quran define the central authority, the markaz, that actually has the power to enforce these rights? Who runs this state? How is power distributed among the people to ensure the central authority doesn't become tyrannical itself?
That is the crucial next step question, because you cannot have universal human rights without a mechanism of governance to uphold them.
And that is exactly where we will go in our next deep dive. But for now, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over. We opened by talking about looking at a document and expecting one thing, but finding a complex, hidden architecture of liberation.
We did.
We looked at a text from 1400 years ago, and we found that it utilized mitigating circumstances and startup enterprise grants to structurally eradicate human subjugation. It used a grammatical grandfather clause to transition an economy away from exploitation without collapsing society.
The diagnostic clarity of the text is profound when read correctly.
It really is. So ask yourself, as you look at the world today, at our modern institutions, what seemingly unchangeable socioeconomic systems are we currently accepting? What systems of perpetual debt, of exploited labor, of vast normalized inequality do we just accept as the way things are?
We accept a lot.
And if a 7th century text could deploy an algorithm to dismantle the global slave trade, what modern systems actually desperately need to be completely rewritten?